Hello there. Chris here.
And Kayla.
This podcast episode is not an episode of Cult or Just Weird. We aren't here today to discuss cult groups or weird things. In fact, our intent with this episode isn't to deliver an interesting and valuable story to our audience at all. This episode is a tribute in audio form. Kayla and I have the honor and privilege of having a podcast platform to be able to do this, and so we are taking advantage of it in order to memorialize a family member. It is only incidental that you be able to listen to it. However, since you are listening, and this episode is now a part of the Cult or Just Weird podcast feed, it is extremely important that we put some content warnings in before we begin. If you are, understandably, listening to the show in order to hear about cults and weirds and don't wish to hear us tell a personal story, I suggest hitting the stop button. If for any reason you do not wish to listen to a story involving medical trauma and associated distress, this is a good time to tap out. If, in particular, you have trouble hearing about pregnancy and infant loss, please be advised to turn off the episode at this time. With that, Kayla is now going to start telling you a story.
In June 2020, Chris and I were elated to learn we'd be adding a third host to the podcast when we found out I was pregnant. We've wanted to be parents for several years, and it had been a bit of a bumpy road getting there. So hearing this news felt like a bright spot that helped drown out the rest of the horrors of 2020. We would be shepherding a new little human into the world, someone who would make this place better just by being here. We would be creating a life in the most biologically magical way. We'd have someone to tell bad jokes to and teach proper skepticism to, and we were very happy. Like everything else in 2020, the pregnancy itself was a bit of a shit show. Even though we were excited to have this experience, it was marked by extreme all-day morning sickness for me and a number of complications. We endured miscarriage scares, invasive testing, and intense anxiety as we moved through the first 20 weeks. Along the way, we learned the sex of our baby, male, and began to feel the first flutters of movement that eventually gave way to such strong kicks and punches that they'd knock the wind out of me. Feeling our son move in the womb was a life highlight. He was very active, moving around all hours of the day and kicking so hard you could see the movements from the outside of my stomach. And at every prenatal visit, checkup, and test, the doctors would laugh with us as our son moved around so much it made it hard for them to get things done. At around 20 weeks, we breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief when the anatomy scan, which is a lengthy, detailed ultrasound, showed us our son was developing as expected. It felt like we could finally relax into the final stretch of our pregnancy and truly prepare to welcome our son home. The anatomy scan was a happy moment. We got to spend 30 minutes watching our son squirm around in his cozy home, imagining what he would look like when we finally got to meet him. My morning sickness began to wear off. I began to quote-unquote show. And even though I was still dealing with some downsides of pregnancy, back pain, heartburn, difficulty breathing, trouble sleeping, harsh allergies, on and on, we were just happy to know everything was okay with our son. And then 8.5 weeks later, everything would be different. I woke up on December 21st, uncomfortable in bed, and switched to the couch where I could watch bad TV and fall asleep again. This was kind of my routine. At 7:30 a.m., I was woken up by what felt like a snap or a big kick from our son, and I instantly knew that my water had broken prematurely. Apologies for the graphic language, but I can only describe what happened as fluid literally pouring out of me. I knew I was only 28.5 weeks into my pregnancy, and something like this was not a good sign, so I cried for about 30 seconds before scrambling for the phone number for my midwife and paging the emergency number. I then had to wake Chris up from deep sleep with the news that something was very wrong. I knew he was panicking, but he kept calm as he held my panic together and herded us quickly into the car to make the drive to the hospital. My midwife called me back and confirmed what was happening to me was unusual, and we needed to head directly to labor and delivery. Being so early in the pregnancy, Chris and I didn't even have a hospital bag packed and basically left with just the clothes on our backs. The anxiety on the way to the hospital was severe. I barely remember making the long walk from the valet to the labor and delivery ward. My water was still leaking, and I hadn't felt the baby kick since it had broken. Plus, the threat of COVID was now very real, as Chris and I were directed to a room at the hospital, now surrounded by nurses and healthcare workers. As I laid in the hospital bed, a nurse named Julie confirmed that my water had broken, and I would now be in the hospital until the baby arrived. Chris and I looked at each other. Okay, and when will that be? We were told that the baby could arrive at any moment, or he could arrive closer to his due date of March 11th. So we were now looking at the possibility of me living in the hospital for almost 3 months during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in the literal epicenter of the disease. But okay, we can do this. It is what it is. We'll figure it out. And sitting in a hospital bed watching bad TV wasn't that different from what I'd be doing at home anyway. As we were wrapping our heads around this new possible reality, things shifted again. At around 9:30 a.m., I felt a very, very faint cramp. About 5 minutes later, I felt another, slightly stronger, and I alerted the nurse. 4 minutes later, another stronger one. Shortly, I was experiencing powerful, intense contractions, more physically demanding than any pain I'd ever felt before, and I've endured some intense physical pain in my life. From here, everything began to move very quickly, and I could only process some of it as my contractions became all-encompassing. Unlike what I'd learned about contractions, there was almost no break between these, just wave after wave after wave of excruciating sensation. More and more nurses and doctors came in and out of the hospital room. At one point, several nurses were attempting to insert an IV into my arm, and after failing for precious minutes to find a vein, I was hit with a contraction too strong to breathe through, which forced me out of bed. I literally jumped to my feet against the protestations of the nurses, and when I looked down, I saw why they were shouting at me. I had literally ripped the IV out of my arm and was now bleeding profusely, but I literally did not care. The only thing I cared about was riding out the waves of my contractions. At some point, an OBGYN and a resident came into the room to check my dilation. Quick lesson for those who may not know, when someone is in active labor, their contractions are literally the large, powerful muscle of the uterus contracting in order to widen the small opening of the cervix to allow the baby to pass through the birth canal when labor turns into delivery. Active labor lasts on average 4 to 8 hours, with your cervix dilating or opening about 1 centimeter per hour. Full dilation is when the cervix opens to 10 centimeters, and that indicates it is time to transition to having the baby, and the pushing phase soon follows. So for most people, getting fully dilated is an hours-long process. My dilation was checked around 10 a.m. after I'd been experiencing contractions for 30 minutes, and I was fully dilated. My body did in 30 minutes what it should have taken hours upon hours to do, and this is probably why it was so painful. I mean, I can't accurately describe what this process felt like. One way to put it is I'm an extremely modest, self-conscious person. Like, I get changed in the bathroom at the gym rather than the locker room level of modest. But when I was in labor, my hospital gown was fully open, and I was basically fully nude in a room full of nurses and doctors, and I did not care. I was shouting curse words. I was snapping at people. I was ready to punch a bear. The only thing I wanted to do was move my body when the contractions hit, like physically get up and move around. So laying still in a bed was the furthest thing from possible, but it was something the doctors needed me to do time and time again. This time, as they checked my dilation, they needed me to do just that so they could check the position of the baby, and he was breech, meaning in the opposite position he needed to be in for birth. The proper position for the baby is head down. This kid decided he was going to come out butt first. So the doctor told us we were now looking at a cesarean birth, and we were looking at it ASAP. So as quickly as things had been moving before, they kicked into overdrive now. My contractions were coming stronger and stronger, and I now had the added pressure of a dozen healthcare workers shouting at me, "Don't push!" Every time I had a contraction. Pushing would compromise the ability to perform a cesarean, but when you are 10 centimeters dilated with a butt-first baby determined to come out, don't push is not exactly something that feels possible, but I tried. I really tried. I'm sorry to all of the doctors at the hospital for all of the yelling I did at you. At some point, I was taken out of the hospital room and wheeled to an operating room, leaving Chris behind. Sorry, Chris. In this operating room, there were now a dozen more people running around, getting things ready for my cesarean. I met the anesthesiologist who would be doing my spinal block, injecting the anesthesia I'd need to be numbed for surgery into my spinal cord. This was extremely stressful because I'd need to hold completely still for the process, and I was still experiencing strong contractions that I could only deal with by moving. Luckily, Julie the nurse was there by my side, literally holding me up and allowing me to grab onto her with my full strength during the process. Eventually, the anesthesiologist was able to get the spinal in, and I was laid down so it could get to work. Surgery would be happening soon.
Meanwhile, as all of this was happening, I was left by myself in the hospital room. Of course, this whole experience had been terrifying, but This particular moment was extra terrifying. It felt like I was in the room for maybe hours and hours, but it was probably only like 20 minutes or so. And the last thing I remember seeing before being by myself for those 20 minutes is my wife shrieking in pain, being attended and yelled at by at least a dozen doctors and nurses, yelling back at them, blood fountaining from her arm because she was physically unable to be still for the catheter needle, as she mentioned. And next thing you know, I'm alone, with the knowledge that the next thing that they're planning on doing is sticking a needle going straight into her spine, with her unable to sit still. And God only knows then also what was happening with the baby. So pacing in that room alone was its own special little nightmare time. A nurse finally came to collect me and take me to the OR, and I asked her on the way if Kayla had received her spinal anesthesia yet, and she said yes, and it went well. And I stopped in my tracks and doubled over and coughed and cried for a few seconds just from the physical impact of that relief. After getting me into a bunch of clean suit, hairnet type stuff, I finally got to enter the OR and see Kayla from the neck up thanks to the surgery veil, looking about as desperate and frightened as I've ever seen her.
I didn't hide it well. I thought I looked nice. I thought I covered.
I could tell you were trying to cover, but you definitely looked distressed.
Cool. So I'm laying there, and yes, I am stressing. I'm mostly stressed about the medication that they'd injected into my spine. I'm worried that it's not going to work before they start cutting into me. That was my big stressor at this moment. Chris came in, thank God. He held my hand. He distracted me as the cesarean, as literal surgery commenced on my body. There was a sheet hung up to prevent us from seeing what was going on, but I could feel every damn thing. The medicine did work. It didn't hurt, but I could feel pressure and movement, and it was the most bizarre sensation of my life as they literally pulled a baby out of me. Chris and I pleaded with the universe for the baby to be okay, and as we waited for news, and eventually we were told that our son was born. It was 10:57 a.m. I then heard all the doctors collectively go, "Aww," and that was when I knew our baby was alive, and of course had just done something hella cute. Because he was so premature, he was immediately taken to the NICU, the neonatal intensive care unit. But as he was wheeled by us, Chris was able to see him and even heard a teeny tiny 3-pound cry. We were stuck in the OR for a bit longer as the doctor also removed a fibroid attached to my uterus. A fibroid is a benign growth that many people have. It was hard to keep waiting before we could meet our son, but we had to wait regardless. I had been given a COVID test before surgery, and of course, we needed the results before we could enter the NICU. I was stitched up, I was cleaned up, and Chris and I were taken back to the hospital room to wait. When I was eventually given the all clear, I was wheeled to the NICU, Chris in tow, so we could finally meet our son. Arthur Scipio Dobson-Carlson was born 3 pounds, 0.8 ounces. He was 15 inches tall. He was pink with dark hair and eyes that looked exactly like his father's. His skin was warm when I touched it, which I was allowed to do at this point. I still had to lay in bed, though, so Chris took a picture of our beautiful baby so I could get a better look. Arthur was hooked up to so many wires and machines and had a breathing tube, but he was here, and he was perfect.
It was at this point that I wept for, 5-10 minutes straight? Or maybe it was only 10 seconds. Who knows? But it was at this point that I finally felt like I had a son, and the upwelling of emotion was just too much to contain. A tremendous amount of joy and happiness from being able to see my first child in the flesh, feeling so terrible for him that he had to be attached to so many tubes and wires, being terrified about his health and well-being, but still relieved that he was here and stable, and looking forward to his whole life. Up to that point, it was easily the most emotional few minutes of my life.
Over the next day and a half, Chris and I got to spend more time with our son as he built up his strength in the NICU. And when I say strength, I mean strength. The kid was already very big for his age. Most babies at 28 weeks are closer to 1 to 2 pounds, and our kid was 3. The strong kicks and punches he debuted in the womb made an appearance outside in the world. He would fight with the nurses as they did their tests, kicking at the x-ray machines and being so feisty as to even grab at his breathing tube. But he was happy and cozy in his isolette, where the various wires he was hooked up to kept tabs on his vital signs that all looked good. There was even talk of removing his breathing tube in the next few days, given how strong his lungs were. The isolette was warm, snug, and dark to mimic the safety of the womb, and Arthur was cared for by the sure hands of the NICU nurses, and us whenever we got the chance. We held his small limbs, talked to him, marveled when he opened his eyes to look at us, sang to him, helped the nurses take his temperature and change his tiny diapers. We even got to feed him small amounts of colostrum I was producing, which he loved. Some of the most magical moments were when his teeny tiny hands would grab our fingers. Every interaction with our son was an incredible joy, and when we weren't with him, we were in my hospital room resting and thinking about the kind of person our son would grow into. At 28 weeks and 4 days old, our son had a great chance of surviving his stay in the NICU and coming home with us a number of weeks later. We looked up the stats, and preemies of his age are cited as having a 95% chance of surviving. We felt good about this. 95% is close enough to 100% that we assumed the worst was behind us. We talked about how we would handle the next few months. I would be discharged soon, and we would spend our days traveling back and forth to the hospital to spend as much time with our son as possible as he became strong enough to eventually come home. We talked about what our Christmas in the NICU would look like with him in a few days. We talked to the nurses and learned more about how things would go as we all settled into this day, and we discussed baby names. Arthur had come so early that we hadn't landed on a name yet, and at this point we were just calling him Baby. We had some names in mind, but we wanted to get to know him a little bit better before landing on anything. Time slowed a bit between Arthur's birth and the next day and a half. We were able to relax a little. We counted the hours between visits. We acquainted ourselves with the breast pump. I was given pain medication every few hours, and my vitals were checked. We thought about the future a lot as we enjoyed the beauty of the present. On Wednesday, December 23rd, time sped up again and also slammed to a halt. As we slept in the recovery room, we were woken up by Arthur's NICU doctor at 7:30 a.m., the urgency in her voice piercing the peace and comfort of the last day and a half like a sharp knife. "We have a critical situation," she stated. The floor dropped out from under us, and the air was sucked from the room as she explained that Arthur's vitals were in a free fall, and the doctors weren't sure why. He was not doing well, he may have internal bleeding, and he needed to be rushed to another higher-level NICU hospital for immediate surgery. I think I said, okay, 1,000 times as I tried to process what was happening. Our son was in danger. We were standing on quicksand, and the next few hours, the next few moments would determine the rest of our lives. Chris and I got ourselves together as best as we could so that we could go to Arthur in the NICU to see him, to be with him, to send him off to the new NICU, and to communicate with the care team transferring him. It was horrible. Our beautiful, healthy, strong pink baby boy was in distress. He was pale and small, hooked up to even more machines now. And as the transferring doctors and EMTs rushed around us to prepare Arthur for the ambulance, we could do nothing but put our hands on our son and tell him what a good job he was doing, how strong he was, how much we loved him, and how we were here for him. The transferring doctor was named, serendipitously, Art, and explained to us how the transfer would work. I have no idea what he said. I placed all of my faith, all of my trust and hope and confidence in these doctors. I needed them to care for my son. I needed them to make everything okay. We watched as he was transferred to an isolette that would house him during the ambulance ride, and then he was wheeled away from us out of sight. Chris quietly pointed out that could be the last time we'd ever see our son. I pointed out that had been true of every time we had seen him and every time we would see him in the future. The next hour was even more excruciating pain than labor had been. We had to wait for me to get discharged from the hospital before we could go join Arthur at the new NICU. I was only 2 days out from major abdominal surgery, and though I was doing well, this would be an early discharge. The seconds dragged by, wading through mud and cement as we waited for a doctor to clear me, as we waited for a pharmacy to open to give me the pain medicine I would need. An admin person, completely unaware of what was happening to us, came in to pester us about birth certificate paperwork we'd been given the day before. We hadn't filled it out yet because we hadn't decided on a name, but it was time now. And we knew at this moment that our son was Arthur Scipio, that he had been all along. Arthur, a king's name, the strength of a bear. Scipio, a name to us evoking resilience and the style of birth that had brought him into the world. Arthur Scipio Dobson-Carlson, the perfect name. Chris went to ready the car so we could take off as soon as it was made formal, and as I waited those few moments alone in the hospital room, I received a call from Arthur's doctor at the new NICU. I don't remember the exact nature of the update. I just remember that the call forced me to sit down, and the phrase, "the prognosis is poor," was said. I knew then that our hope was just that, hope. We were now looking at the 5% chance of non-survival that had previously seemed so small. And now it was huge. 5% was big enough to swallow the three of us whole. The doctor made it clear that the ref hadn't called it yet. We might still stick the landing. But our hope was a liability now, and we needed to begin preparing ourselves for the worst. A discharge nurse then brought me a wheelchair and wheeled me through the seemingly endless halls of the hospital. The news the phone call had carried weighing on me heavily. I, again, have no idea what the nurse said to me, what I said to her, if we even talked. I was finally brought to the car where Chris was waiting at the wheel. and he saw my face and asked, "Are you okay?" And I could just turn to him twice and say, "It's not looking good." We raced to the new hospital, Chris weaving in and out of cars, driving with the speed of a father who'd just been told his child was likely dying. The route from Santa Monica to Westwood is now soiled forever, given a context that cannot wash off. We arrived at the NICU 20 minutes later and had to navigate through a massive building to find our son. In 10 years, I'll maybe be able to look back on these moments and find the comedy, because there were many comedic moments, us getting on the wrong elevator, us trying to find the right doors, us stopping unsuspecting residents, begging for directions, but for now, the humor eludes me. We found the NICU minutes later and were greeted by a team that began the slow process of confirming our fears. Our son was dying. They would do their best, but our son was dying. They'd seen babies pull through this before, but our son was dying. Our son was dying.
December 23rd, 2020 was just a series of seemingly endless drops for my heart and stomach. I wake up in the morning to the doctor's voice saying that our son was critical, stomach drop. Seeing him in the NICU with all the extra healthcare workers and wires before being transferred, heart drop. Kayla getting in the car after discharge from the first hospital and telling me it wasn't looking good, stomach drop. Listening to the new doctor at Ronald Reagan Hospital, heart drop. Kind of like being on a roller coaster that only has downward hills and it ends in a flat cement wall.
Various members of Arthur's care team greeted us, letting us know the severity of the situation, letting us know what they thought might be wrong, letting us know what they would do. Yet again, I don't remember much of it. A social worker asked us if we wanted a chaplain, and we said yes without hesitation. And then we went to Arthur's side. This new NICU was crammed, again, with more than a dozen healthcare workers, doctors, nurses, anesthesiologists, surgeons, and more, all fluttering around our son, trying to keep him alive. Our beautiful boy was heavily medicated now, numb to the world, and thankfully, blessedly unaware of what was happening to him. We were able to be with him, stand with him, touch him, and talk to him. This is the part that I think about the most, that I hate. It's really hard. It's the part that I try not to think about.
Yeah. Take your time.
All the moments of pain we'd experienced in the past few days could not touch these moments. This was unbearable, and we had to bear it. The chaplain arrived, and Arthur was baptized in the Catholic Church, the faith that Chris had been raised in. And then the doctors would begin to attempt surgery. They suspected a bleed was happening in his liver, a bleed that would be very difficult to stop, given the organ was about as strong as tissue paper. But they would try to go in, they would try to repair it, and with everything else, they pulled no punches. Arthur would likely not survive the attempts. Arthur would likely not survive the day. Chris and I waited in a conference room next to the NICU, rotating through a gamut of emotions. Crying, shouting, vocalizing, freezing. Someone brought us food. I ate. Someone brought us water and juice. We drank. The social worker came in and offered support. Nurses came in to check on us. Doctors came in to update us. At one point, a doctor came in and offered us a glimmer of hope. Arthur's heart rate was up. He might be strong enough to withstand attempts at surgery. We okayed them, trying to continue, knowing better than to let the hope take hold in our hearts and letting it take hold anyway. Chris and I prayed, asking whoever might impossibly be listening to let us stay in that 95%, to let the three of us pull through. A doctor knocked on the door. Our prayers would not be answered today. Arthur was not responding to the attempts at surgery. He had bleeding in all his major organs, including his brain. He would not survive further attempts. We needed to tell the doctors it was okay to stop trying to save our son. The world was ending. Reality was shattering around us. We gave the okay, and in moments, Arthur was gone. Our beautiful baby boy died at 12:40 p.m. on Wednesday, December 23rd. He had been impatient to enter the world. He had then been impatient to continue moving on. He had been here for 50 hours. No more. Our lives screeched to a halt. And still we had to move forward. We knew the hardest part was still ahead of us. Our time to say goodbye. Arthur had died before we had gotten the chance to hold him, to look at his beautiful face without wires and tubes in the way. He had died, and this would be our only chance to do those things. The nurses swaddled his small body in a blanket, tugged a cozy hat on his small head. The curtains were drawn around the NICU isolette where he had died, and Chris and I were led to his bedside, where the three of us could spend our last physical moments as a family. Arthur was beautiful, even in death. His eyes were still his father's, his mouth was small and open, his nose upturned. His body was no longer pink and warm, but instead bruised and cold, but he was our beautiful son. We held him, we kissed him, we spoke to him and said our goodbyes. The chaplain said one last prayer over his body. We sat in chairs next to his body as it rested in the isolette. There were huge windows to one side, and I could see out over the roof of the hospital, out over the roofs of nearby houses, over roads and trees. Steam rose into the air from some nearby vent. The world outside continued turning, and my son was gone. Arthur would be with us always, but in this way he was gone. Our story as a family doesn't end here. We're about a month out from Arthur's birthday and death day, still in the thick of our grief, still trying to figure out what it means to move forward in this new reality. We're in the chapter of a book that feels written for someone else, but it's our story now. Chris and I are parents, something we have always wanted to be. Our child isn't alive, and he's a part of our family now and forever. Arthur's arrival changed so much, and his departure did the same. We are different people now. The complications from his birth will make it much, much more difficult for my body to carry future children. The future is terrifying in new and terrible ways. But Arthur's presence in our lives is a gift in ways I can barely put into words. We are different people now. We want to bring Arthur's future siblings into the world however we can. The future allows us opportunities to deepen our relationship with our son, and we know it will better us as people. Arthur was only here for 50 hours, and he used that short life to make the world a better place. The autopsy of his body will be added to the medical knowledge of the hospital staff, hopefully preventing the same thing from happening to future babies. The breast milk my body makes, the milk that is meant for him, will be donated to NICU babies in need. The family we build will always know about Arthur and the utter joy and incredible sorrow he brought with him. We love our son, and I'm just so glad we got to meet him.
December 23rd, 2020 was the worst day of my life so far, by a country mile. I say so far because one of the things that this experience has done to us is to truly cripple our sense of optimism or even of balance. The common phrase that people say when they're trying to cheer up a friend or shore up their resolve, what's the worst that could happen, suddenly has a very clear answer for us. 2 years ago, Kayla had an ectopic pregnancy, which was its own horrific hospital visit and cost her a fallopian tube. And that felt like, quote, the worst that could happen, end quote, and that things obviously had to get better from there. We know now that this is very much not a foregone conclusion. On top of that loss of balance, I personally still have daytime panic and nightmarish visions of that conference room in the hospital, where I had to tell the lead doctor that it was okay to stop resuscitation efforts for my son. Even writing the script and saying these words now is incredibly difficult because of how much I've had to revisit that conference room in my mind. In the days and weeks following, I kept having the sense that I'd still wake up that morning of December 21st, and all of this just would have been a horrible nightmare. Every day I wake up since then is another bit of proof that that won't happen, and the feeling of unreality has started to fade. But it's also still a long way from gone. For those of you listening, I wish I could give some nice, easy, and happy conclusion to this story and say that everything is completely fine now, and tune in next week to Cult or Just Weird. But the reality is I can't. This isn't an episode of the podcast. This is a retelling of a story that happened to me, Kayla, and our son Arthur. What happened wasn't fine, and our lives and our brains and our stories have changed as a result. There is no going back to who we were before. I hope and believe we will get to a place as a family that is peaceful, positive, and full of love. But what happened will never be just fine. And even if and when the emotional cut heals, the scar never will. I do have some more things to add though, so please bear with me. First of all, Kayla and I are constantly talking about mental health practices on the show, and it's my hope that we've been able to help destigmatize mental health, even if just a little bit. Having that overall attitude, I think, has helped us so far, because we have been seeking a lot of support. On top of our regular individual therapists, we are also doing couples therapy for the first time, with a therapist specializing in infant loss. and we have joined several support groups after doing some digging and research to find ones that would be best for us. Needless to say, these support groups would probably be better if they were in person instead of Zoom, but the pandemic is just another layer of how completely shitty this whole experience has been for us, keeping us isolated from friends and family when we needed them most. That being said, the support of our friends and family in all forms other than physical presence has been one of, if not the biggest silver lining of this whole process. It would take too long to name everyone here, but if you are a friend or family member listening to this, which I know there are a bunch because they even support our podcast, then we want to say thank you. But not just thank you for texting me or thank you for sending us food. Thank you for reminding us repeatedly during these hard times and also in better times why our dumb lives are worth even living in the first place. I have a curious side note before I say a few words about my son. If you are a regular listener of our podcast, you may have already listened to the last episode of Season 2, which was also the last episode of our QAnon series. Kayla and I wrote that episode and knew at least a month in advance that we wanted it to be themed around hope and resilience because we felt like that was the most positive and effective way to end a series about such a scary and depressing topic, and it also felt like a good note to end a season on, especially a season that was also ending at the end of 2020. We recorded that episode on the 20th of December, less than 24 hours before Arthur was born. When we finally summoned the will to edit the audio a few weeks later, it eerily felt like our past selves talking to our current selves. And even though those past selves were only a few weeks old, they felt like entirely different humans. In a very real sense, they were. It was strange listening to ourselves talk about these topics. Strange and hard to reconcile with our experiences. I'm not sure how or when we will be able to feel hopeful again or how much resilience we really have left right now, but maybe someday we will be able to listen to our own episode again and take our own advice to heart. I can scoff and sneer at our past selves and say, ew, easy for you to say, but that doesn't mean that they were wrong. So before we sign off, I want to say a few words about our beloved son. As Kayla mentioned, he had my eyes, he had her nose, and he had ears that he got from God knows where. He had a shock of black hair, and he was already a giant pain in the ass, squirming around when nurses tried to change him and adjust his instruments. He had very, very little time on Earth. As of the time I'm writing this, on February 1st, 2021, it's been about 20 Arthur lifetimes since we last saw him alive. I feel bad for Kayla and myself and all of the people that he never got to meet and make happy. But in a weird way, I almost don't feel as bad for him because the only thing he ever felt for literally his whole entire life was comfort and love. The NICU nurses assured me that one of their top priorities for the preemie babies was their comfort for developmental reasons. And the only thing he ever felt from us, his parents, and from all of our friends and family through us for, again, his whole entire life was love. That whole entire life feels extremely short. 50 hours does not sound like a lot of time because of our biases as humans. But on a cosmic... time scale...
No rush.
But on a cosmic time scale, by the time that there are only iron stars left in a sky that ceased to exist multiple forevers ago, 50 hours truly is no different than 80 years. All time is short. My lifetime is no more of an eye blink than his was. He has given Kayla and I gifts, some of which we are still discovering. One of the gifts that he gave me was something I lost a long time ago. When you grow up with religion like I did, and then later in life you move towards a more materialist worldview and become an atheist, one of the things that can happen is you develop an intense fear of death and the nothingness that may come with it. It was hard, at least for me, to lose that safety net from religion, that concept of an afterlife. For a long time now, I've had a very difficult time coming to terms with my own eventual mortality. I would certainly be a shameful coward on any battlefield, I'll tell you that. However, with Arthur's birth and subsequent death, I caught myself wishing something that I never thought that I would, that I could trade my life for his. Sometimes I still pray to a God I don't believe in for this. Ultimately, I know it's futile, And now that he's permanently gone, that underlying fear has returned. But he gave me a glimpse into a post-existential terror life that I never thought would be possible. There are many other gifts that he has given to me and Kayla, but I wanted to say that one out loud because to me it is so incredibly important. Finally, I also want to say that I am proud of him, not just for the gifts that he's given us, but that he left the world better than he found it. That's the only golden rule I feel is worth remembering at this point, and I just hope that I can live up to his example. As Kayla mentioned, we are donating the milk that she is producing for him, his milk, to other NICU babies that need it. That really is him making the world better. Immediately after his death, as she mentioned, we authorized his body to be autopsied for study by the hospital after verifying that it would be added to the body of medical knowledge for NICU doctors and nurses. That is him making the world better. His time on Earth was short, but he was loved the entire time he was here, and he left it better than he found it. If you are listening to this, I hope you remember his story, and I would ask, on his behalf, that you think of him sometime when you leave something better than you found it. Maybe it's picking up a piece of trash that someone else left somewhere. Maybe it's paying for the person in line behind you at Starbucks. Maybe it's just telling someone you love how awesome they are for no reason. Maybe it's planting a tree, or wearing a mask, or visiting someone who needs company, donating to a good cause, or fixing something you didn't break. There are a million ways to leave it better than you found it. I ask that you don't feel pressure to do any of these things. But if and when you do, it would make me and Kayla happy to think that maybe you will say his name in your mind or quietly to yourself. Arthur.